Claire's life had always been a picture of happiness. Growing up in a grand estate just outside of Boston, she was surrounded by love, comfort, and the warm presence of her mother, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was more than just a parent. She was Claire's best friend, guiding her with kindness and a wisdom that belied her years. But when Elizabeth fell ill, everything changed. Claire was only 12 when her mother passed away, leaving an irreplaceable void in her life. The once vibrant home became a place of shadows and silence. Claire's father, Richard, who had always been her pillar of strength, withdrew into himself, drowning his grief in work. Claire was left to navigate her sorrow alone, clinging to the fading memories of her mother. 2 years passed, and in an attempt to bring some joy back into their lives, Richard remarried. Sarah was beautiful, poised, and seemingly everything a grieving family could hope for. She had a way of making people feel at ease, and at first Claire thought she might finally find some semblance of happiness again. But there was something about Sarah that Claire couldn't quite place. It wasn't overtly sinister, but a coldness seemed to linger just beneath her warm smile. Despite her efforts to welcome this new woman into her life, Claire felt a growing distance between them. It was as if Sarah was always just out of reach, her kindness veiled in a thin layer of insincerity. Richard, however, was smitten. Sarah brought him out of his depression, filling the house with laughter and life once more. He was so grateful to have found someone who could make him feel alive again that he didn't notice the subtle ways in which Sarah was starting to exert her influence. She gradually took over the household, making decisions without consulting Claire or even Richard. Claire's once cherished opinions were now dismissed or ignored altogether. At first, Claire tried to rationalize Sarah's behavior. Maybe she was just trying too hard, or perhaps it was her way of asserting herself in a new home. But as time went on, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The warmth that Sarah displayed to others never seemed to reach her. Instead, there was a growing tension between them, a silent battle that only Claire seemed to notice. Sarah began to subtly undermine Claire at every turn, always with a sweet smile that masked the sting of her words. She would comment on Claire's appearance, her behavior, or her interests, always in a way that made Claire feel small and insignificant. Richard, blinded by his love for Sarah, never noticed the shift. To him, Sarah was the light that had brought him back from the brink of despair. Claire, however, felt increasingly isolated in her own home. The first time Claire confronted her father about Sarah, he dismissed her concerns as teenage angst. "You need to give her a chance, Claire. She's trying to help us heal," he had said, his voice tinged with impatience. Claire wanted to believe him, but the unease in her heart only grew. As Claire's 16th birthday approached, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. It would be the first birthday without her mother, and she couldn't imagine celebrating it without her. Sarah, sensing this, insisted on planning the entire event. "You deserve something special," she had said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Claire nodded, too tired to argue. But deep down, she knew that this birthday would mark the beginning of something darker, a new chapter in her life that would challenge everything she had ever known. As the months passed, the relationship between Claire and Sarah grew increasingly strained. What had once been subtle discomfort had now evolved into a palpable tension. Sarah's warmth had long since faded, replaced by a coldness that Claire couldn't ignore. It was as if a switch had flipped, and now Sarah's true nature was beginning to show. Claire noticed how Sarah would often belittle her in front of others, disguising her harsh words as jokes. "Oh, Claire, you're still so naive," she would say with a laugh, while guests at the dinner table chuckled awkwardly. Claire would force a smile, but inside, she felt the sting of Sarah's words deeply. Every comment seemed to chip away at her confidence, leaving her feeling increasingly isolated. Sarah's envy became more apparent when it came to matters of inheritance. Although Claire was still young, it was well known that she would one day inherit her mother's considerable fortune. Elizabeth had come from old money, and that wealth was now in trust for Claire until she came of age. Sarah, however, seemed to have her sights set on that money, and Claire could sense it. One evening, as they sat in the study, Sarah brought up the subject of the estate. "You know, Claire," she began casually. "Managing such a large fortune requires a certain level of experience. It might be wise for your father and me to take a more active role in handling the trust." Claire looked up from the book she was pretending to read, her heart pounding. She knew where this was going. "I'm sure when the time comes, I'll have plenty of guidance," she replied carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, darling. I just want to make sure everything is taken care of properly. Your mother worked hard to build this, and it would be a shame if something were to happen to it." Claire's stomach twisted at the mention of her mother. She had a feeling that Sarah's sudden interest in the estate was less about protecting her mother's legacy and more about securing her own future. But what could she do? Her father was blind to Sarah's manipulations, and every time Claire tried to voice her concerns, Richard would dismiss them as paranoia. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's behavior grew more brazen. She began making decisions about the household finances without consulting anyone, moving money around, and reallocating funds under the guise of managing the estate more efficiently. Claire felt increasingly powerless, as if the walls were closing in around her. One particularly cold evening, Claire overheard a conversation between Sarah and Richard that sent a chill down her spine. She had just returned from a walk and was about to enter the sitting room when she heard her name mentioned. "Claire is almost 17 now, Richard," Sarah was saying. "She's old enough to start thinking about her future, and that includes her financial responsibilities. We need to prepare her for the real world, and that means making some hard decisions." Richard sighed, sounding tired. "I know, Sarah, but I don't want to push her too hard. She's still dealing with the loss of her mother. I just want her to be happy. And she will be, but she needs to grow up," Sarah insisted, her tone firmer now. "We can't keep coddling her. She needs to understand that life isn't just about inheriting money. It's about earning it, managing it, and sometimes making sacrifices." Claire felt a surge of anger and fear. Sarah was trying to take control, to push her out of her own life. But what could she do? Every attempt to speak up only seemed to drive a wedge further between her and her father. The next day, Claire tried once more to talk to Richard, to express her unease about Sarah's increasing influence. "Dad, I think we need to talk about Sarah and the estate," she began hesitantly as they sat in his study. Richard looked up from his paperwork, frowning slightly. "What about it, Claire? Sarah's just trying to help. She's been a godsend to us both." Claire swallowed hard. "I know she's been supportive, but I feel like she's taking over things that maybe she shouldn't. Moms trust the estate. It just doesn't feel right." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Claire, you're young. You don't understand how complicated these things are. Sarah has experience with financial matters. She's only doing what she thinks is best for us." "But Dad," Claire started, only to be cut off. "Enough, Claire," Richard said, his tone final. "I trust Sarah. You should too." Claire felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She realized that arguing would get her nowhere. Sarah had her father completely under her control, and there was nothing Claire could do to change that. For the first time, she felt truly alone, abandoned not just by her mother's death, but by the one person she thought would always be on her side. As Claire left the study, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's envy was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And deep down, she knew that something terrible was looming on the horizon. As the days passed, Claire couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. The tension in the house was almost unbearable, but she had no choice but to endure it. Sarah's presence seemed to loom over every corner of the estate, her watchful eyes always following Claire. Richard, oblivious to the growing unease, continued to trust Sarah implicitly, leaving Claire feeling more isolated than ever. One evening, as the autumn chill began to creep into the air, Sarah approached Claire with an unexpected suggestion. "Claire, I was thinking," she began, her voice smooth and pleasant. "You've been so cooped up in this house lately. How about we go for a hike tomorrow? Just the two of us. There's a beautiful trail through the woods not far from here." Claire hesitated, taken aback by the sudden invitation. Sarah had never shown much interest in spending time with her, and the idea of being alone with her in the woods made Claire uneasy. But she also knew that refusing would only cause more tension, and perhaps this was an opportunity to bridge the growing gap between them. Sure, that sounds nice, Claire replied, forcing a smile. It might be good to get some fresh air. Sarah's smile widened, but there was something unsettling in her eyes. Great. We'll leave early in the morning, before the sun gets too hot. You'll love it, Claire. The forest is so peaceful this time of year. That night, as Claire lay in bed, she couldn't stop her mind from racing. The uneasy feeling in her stomach had only grown stronger, and she couldn't help but wonder if she was making a mistake. But she pushed the doubts aside, telling herself that she was being paranoid. After all, what could possibly happen on a simple hike? The next morning, Claire and Sarah set out just after dawn. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and gold, and the crisp autumn air filled Claire's lungs as they made their way into the woods. At first, the hike was uneventful. The trail was narrow and winding, surrounded by towering trees that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The quiet was almost soothing, and for a moment, Claire allowed herself to relax. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The path grew narrower, the trees denser, and the air colder. Claire noticed that Sarah was leading them farther off the main trail, into an area of the woods she didn't recognize. Are you sure we're going the right way? Claire asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of her voice. Of course, Sarah replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. There's a spot up ahead that I want to show you. It's a bit more secluded, but trust me, it's worth it. Claire nodded, though her unease was growing with every step. The forest seemed to close in around them, and the cheerful morning light had dimmed to a gloomy shade. She glanced over her shoulder, noting how far they had come from the main trail. The realization that she was completely alone with Sarah in the middle of the woods made her heart pound in her chest. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a small clearing. The trees opened up to reveal a patch of grass surrounded by thick underbrush. It was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, noticeably absent. Claire looked around, trying to figure out why Sarah had brought her here, but nothing seemed particularly special about the place. This is it, Sarah said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. She turned to face Claire, her expression unreadable. Beautiful, isn't it? Claire nodded uncertainly. And nice, but why did we come all the way out here? Sarah's smile slowly faded, and her gaze hardened. Because, Claire, there are some things you need to learn about the world. Life isn't fair, and people aren't always who they seem to be. Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What do you mean? Sarah took a step closer, her eyes locking onto Claire's. You've had everything handed to you your whole life. A loving mother, a father who adores you, a fortune waiting for you. But you don't know what it's like to struggle, to fight for what you want. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Sarah, I don't understand. You will, Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous. Out here, you're on your own. No one to protect you. No one to save you. Just like the real world. Before Claire could react, Sarah reached in her coat and pulled out a small bag. With a swift motion, she tossed it at Claire's feet. Claire looked down in confusion, seeing a bottle of water and a single granola bar inside. Good luck, Claire, Sarah said with a chilling smile. Let's see how you handle this. With that, Sarah turned on her heel and began to walk away, leaving Claire standing in the clearing, paralyzed with shock. It took a moment for the reality of the situation to sink in, but when it did, panic surged through her. Sarah, wait, Claire called out, her voice trembling. She started to follow, but Sarah quickened her pace, disappearing into the trees. Claire broke into a run, her heart pounding in her chest, but Sarah was already gone. The forest seemed to swallow her whole, leaving Claire utterly alone. Desperation clawed at Claire as she realized the full extent of what had just happened. She was miles from home, with no idea how to get back, and the only person who knew where she was had just abandoned her. The forest, once peaceful and serene, now felt like a vast, impenetrable maze, and Claire had no idea how she would ever find her way out. The panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Claire knew she couldn't afford to lose control. She had to stay calm, had to think. With trembling hands, she picked up the bag Sarah had thrown at her. It was almost laughable. How could she possibly survive on a single granola bar and a bottle of water? But it was all she had. Claire took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't know how long she would be out here, or if anyone would come looking for her. But one thing was clear. If she wanted to survive, she would have to rely on herself. And for the first time in her life, Claire realized just how alone she truly was. Claire stood in the clearing, her heart pounding as the reality of her situation began to sink in. Sarah was gone, and she was truly alone. The forest, once beautiful and serene, now seemed dark and foreboding, its shadows lengthening as the morning light struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of trees. Panic clawed at the edges of Claire's mind, but she forced herself to stay calm. Panicking would only make things worse. She took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. First, she needed to figure out which direction she had come from. But as she turned in a slow circle, she realized with a sinking feeling that she had no idea. The forest looked the same in every direction. Endless rows of trees with no discernible landmarks to guide her. Claire cursed herself for not paying more attention during the hike. She had been too caught up in her unease around Sarah to notice the path they had taken. Claire's mind raced as she considered her options. She could try to retrace her steps, but with no clear memory of the route, she could just as easily get even more lost. She could stay put and hope that someone, her father, maybe would realize she was missing and send help. But that could take hours or even days, and Claire wasn't sure she could survive that long in the woods. The bag Sarah had thrown at her lay at her feet, a cruel reminder of how unprepared she was. Claire picked it up and opened it again, staring at the meager contents, one granola bar and a small bottle of water. It was laughable, really, how little Sarah had left her with. But it was all she had, and she would have to make it last. Claire took a sip of water, just enough to wet her dry throat, and then tucked the bottle back into the bag. She stuffed the granola bar into her jacket pocket, saving it for later. There was no telling how long she might be out here, and she needed to conserve what little resources she had. She looked up at the sky, trying to gauge the time. The sun was still low, but it was rising steadily, which meant it was probably late morning. Claire knew she needed to start moving. Staying in one place wasn't going to help her find her way out. She chose a direction at random, hoping that it would lead her back to the main trail. As she walked, Claire tried to stay focused, but the fear gnawing at her insides made it difficult to think clearly. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made her jump, her imagination conjuring up images of wild animals lurking just out of sight. She knew the forest was home to bears and coyotes, and the thought of encountering one sent a shiver down her spine. But as the hours dragged on and she saw nothing but trees, her fear of wild animals began to give way to a different kind of terror, one of being completely, hopelessly lost. Claire's legs ached from walking, and her throat was parched despite her efforts to ration the water. She hadn't eaten since the night before, and her stomach growled in protest. Finally, she stopped to rest on a fallen log, her body trembling with exhaustion. She pulled the granola bar from her pocket and unwrapped it, breaking it in half. She ate one half slowly, trying to make it last, and tucked the other half back into her pocket for later. As she sat there, trying to gather her strength, Claire's mind wandered back to the events that had led her here. She couldn't believe Sarah had done this to her, left her to fend for herself in the middle of the woods with no way to contact anyone. The woman had always been cold, but Claire had never imagined she was capable of something so cruel. And yet, deep down, Claire had known there was something off about Sarah from the beginning. The way she had wormed her way into Richard's life so quickly after Elizabeth's death. The subtle way she had undermined Claire at every turn. Sarah's actions had always been calculated, but Claire had never realized just how far she would go to get what she wanted. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Claire knew she needed to keep moving, but her body felt heavy, her legs like lead. She pushed herself to stand, clutching the bag to her chest as she continued on. Hours passed, but it felt like days. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze with no way out. Claire's hope began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of despair. What if no one ever found her? What if she was doomed to wander these woods until she collapsed from exhaustion or worse? Just as she was about to give in to the hopelessness threatening to consume her, Claire noticed something in the distance. A break in the trees, a sliver of light that stood out against the darkening forest. With the last of her strength, she hurried toward it, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. As she approached, she realized it was a small cabin, nestled deep within the woods. It looked old, the wood weathered and covered in moss, but it was a sign of civilization, a beacon in the darkness. Claire's legs nearly gave out in relief as she stumbled toward the door, praying that someone would be inside. She knocked weakly, but there was no answer. Claire hesitated for a moment, then tried the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was empty, but there was a bed in the corner, a fireplace, and a table with a few scattered items on it. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, something she desperately needed as night began to fall. Claire stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She sank onto the bed, her body aching with exhaustion. For the first time since Sarah had abandoned her, Claire allowed herself to cry. The tears came in a torrent, all the fear and anger and loneliness she had been holding back spilling out at once. But as she cried, a new resolve began to form within her. She wasn't going to let Sarah win. She wasn't going to let this forest be the end of her. Somehow, she would find a way out of this. And when she did, she would make sure Sarah paid for what she had done. With that thought in mind, Claire wiped her tears and looked around the cabin, her eyes scanning the room for anything that might help her survive the night and find her way back home. Claire woke the next morning to the sound of birds chirping outside the cabin. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was, but the cold, hard bed and the unfamiliar surroundings quickly brought her back to reality. She was still trapped in the middle of the forest, miles from home, with no one to turn to. The fear that had gripped her the day before returned, but she forced herself to push it aside. If she wanted to survive, she had to stay focused. The first thing Claire did was take stock of her situation. The small cabin was sparsely furnished, a bed, a wooden table, and a chair. The fireplace was empty, save for a few cold ashes, and there was a cupboard in the corner that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Claire cautiously walked over to it, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. To her relief, she found a few items inside: a dusty lantern, a box of matches, and a rusted tin canister labeled tea. Claire sighed. There was no food, no water, and no way to communicate with the outside world. The granola bar she had saved was her only sustenance, and the half-empty bottle of water was all that stood between her and dehydration. She knew she had to ration both carefully if she wanted them to last. Her thoughts turned to Sarah and what she had done. Claire couldn't believe that the woman who had promised to care for her could be so heartless. Sarah had left her here to fend for herself, knowing full well that Claire was unprepared for the dangers of the forest. The betrayal cut deep, and for a moment, Claire felt a surge of anger that gave her the strength to keep going. She decided to explore the area around the cabin, hoping to find a stream or a path that could lead her back to civilization. Stepping outside, Claire was struck by how quiet the forest was. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground, but there was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Claire ventured out cautiously, trying to keep her bearings as she wandered through the dense underbrush. The forest was a maze of trees and tangled vines, and every direction looked the same. She had no way of knowing if she was getting closer to safety or further away, but she couldn't afford to stay in one place. After an hour of walking, Claire's throat was dry, and her legs ached with fatigue. She stopped to catch her breath, leaning against a tree as she looked around for any sign of water. Her eyes scanned the ground, and then she noticed something, an old, overgrown path that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. It was barely visible, the remnants of what might have been a trail years ago, but it was the first sign of human activity she had seen. With renewed determination, Claire followed the path, hoping it would lead her to a stream or a road. As she walked, her thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin. There was something about it that unsettled her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The cabin had felt almost too convenient, as if it had been placed there on purpose, waiting for her. The path wound through the trees, growing narrower and more difficult to navigate as she went. Claire had to push aside branches and step over roots that seemed determined to trip her. The further she went, the more oppressive the forest became, the air thickening with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Just as Claire began to doubt whether the path would lead her anywhere, she heard it, a faint, trickling sound. Her heart leaped with hope, and she quickened her pace, following the sound until she stumbled upon a small stream. The water was clear and cool, flowing over smooth stones and disappearing into the dense foliage. Claire knelt by the edge of the stream, cupping her hands to drink. The water was cold and refreshing, and she drank deeply, feeling some of her strength return. After quenching her thirst, Claire filled her bottle with the fresh water, grateful for this small reprieve. But as she looked around, she realized that the stream didn't seem to lead anywhere. It meandered through the forest, disappearing into the underbrush, offering no clear direction back to civilization. Claire knew she couldn't just follow the water. It could lead her even deeper into the wilderness. As she sat by the stream, Claire's thoughts returned to the cabin and the strange feeling it had given her. Something about the place felt off, almost as if it were connected to her in some way. She couldn't explain it, but the unease gnawed at her, refusing to let go. Claire knew she had to return to the cabin and search it more thoroughly. There had to be something there, something that would help her understand why she had been left in the woods. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than before, the forest closing in around her as the afternoon light began to fade. By the time she reached the clearing, Claire was exhausted, her body aching from the strain of the day. But she forced herself to keep going, determined to uncover whatever secrets the cabin held. Inside, the cabin was just as she had left it, the air still and quiet. Claire walked over to the table and began to search through the scattered items, her hands trembling slightly. She found a few old newspapers, yellowed with age, and some crumpled letters that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she unfolded one of the letters, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. The words were difficult to make out, but she could see enough to piece together a message. The letter was addressed to someone named Elizabeth, a name that sent a shock of recognition through Claire. Her mother's name. The letter spoke of a debt, of someone who had promised to repay what was owed but had failed to do so. It was angry, bitter, filled with accusations that made Claire's stomach churn. She flipped through the other letters, her heart racing as she realized that they were all addressed to her mother, all written in the same angry tone. Claire's mind reeled. What was her mother's connection to this place? Why were these letters hidden in a cabin in the middle of the woods? And most importantly, what did Sarah know about it? As she read through the letters, a terrible suspicion began to form in Claire's mind. The pieces were starting to come together, but she needed more information, something that would confirm her worst fears. She continued to search the cabin, opening drawers and cupboards, hoping to find something, anything, that would make sense of the nightmare she had been thrown into. In the back of a drawer, Claire found a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but as she flipped through it, she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was her mother's journal. Claire's hands shook as she turned the pages, her eyes scanning the entries. The journal was filled with her mother's thoughts, her hopes and fears, but as Claire read on, the entries grew darker, more desperate. Her mother had been hiding something that had driven her to the edge. The final entry sent a chill down Claire's spine. It spoke of a debt that could never be repaid, of a promise that had been broken. It mentioned someone who would never forgive, someone who would do anything to settle the score. And then, in the last lines, her mother had written a name, Sarah. Claire's blood ran cold as the truth hit her. Sarah hadn't just married her father for money. She had been planning this all along. The letters, the cabin, the abandonment in the woods. It was all part of Sarah's twisted plan to exact revenge on Claire's family. Claire clutched the journal to her chest, her mind racing. She had to get out of the forest. She had to survive, not just for herself, but for her mother. Whatever Sarah had planned, Claire wasn't going to let her get away with it. With renewed determination, Claire prepared herself to face whatever came next. She was no longer just a lost girl in the woods. She was her mother's daughter, and she would fight with everything she had to make it out alive. Claire's hands trembled as she clutched her mother's journal to her chest. The cabin that had once felt like a refuge now felt like a trap, a place where secrets festered and the past lingered like a shadow. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, anger, fear, and determination all swirling together as she tried to make sense of what she had just discovered. Sarah's connection to her mother, the letters filled with bitterness and resentment, the cryptic references to a debt. It all pointed to a dark and twisted motive that had driven Sarah to abandon her in the woods. But Claire knew she couldn't stay in the cabin. She had to keep moving, to find a way out of the forest before Sarah's plan could reach its deadly conclusion. With the journal in hand, she took one last look around the room, searching for anything else that might help her. She found an old, worn map tucked inside a drawer, its edges frayed and the ink faded, but it was better than nothing. The map seemed to show the area surrounding the cabin, with faint trails marked out and a few notations scrawled in the margins. It wasn't much, but it gave Claire a sense of direction. Determined, Claire stuffed the journal and map into her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and stepped out of the cabin. The forest greeted her with its eerie silence, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches in the wind. It was as if the forest itself was watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. Claire unfolded the map and studied it, tracing her finger along the faded lines. There was a trail that seemed to lead out of the forest, but it was difficult to tell how far it went or if it was still passable. The other paths marked on the map seemed to wind deeper into the wilderness, leading to places Claire didn't want to imagine. She had to trust that the map was accurate and that it would guide her to safety. She set off down the trail, her senses on high alert. The forest was dense, the trees so close together that they blocked out much of the sunlight, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and Claire could hear the distant sound of running water, probably the same stream she had found earlier. As she walked, Claire's thoughts kept returning to the journal. Her mother had known something terrible, that had haunted her until the end. The way she had written about Sarah, the fear and desperation in her words, made Claire's heart ache. Elizabeth had tried to protect her, but whatever secret she had been hiding had now come back to threaten Claire's life. Suddenly, the trail narrowed, and Claire found herself pushing through thick underbrush. The trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at her clothes as she forced her way forward. The path was becoming harder to follow, the once clear trail now little more than a faint outline on the ground. Claire kept moving, her eyes scanning the forest for any sign of danger. Every sound made her jump, a branch snapping in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Her mind raced with thoughts of what Sarah might be planning and what other dangers might be lurking in the forest. As the day wore on, Claire's exhaustion began to catch up with her. Her legs felt heavy, and her throat was parched. She stopped by a small stream to refill her water bottle, but her hands were shaking so badly that she spilled half of it. Frustration welled up inside her, but she forced herself to take deep breaths, trying to stay calm. She couldn't afford to panic. Not now. Just as she was about to start walking again, Claire heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was faint at first, just a rustling in the underbrush, but then it grew louder, a series of snapping twigs and the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone or something was moving through the forest, and it was getting closer. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, searching for a place to hide. The forest offered little in the way of cover, but she spotted a large tree with thick, gnarled roots that formed a small hollow at its base. Without thinking, she crouched down and squeezed herself into the hollow, pulling her knees to her chest and trying to make herself as small as possible. The footsteps grew louder, and Claire held her breath, straining to hear any other sounds that might give her a clue as to who or what was out there. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Claire's heart was beating so loudly that she was sure whoever was out there could hear it. She pressed herself closer to the tree, her body trembling with fear. Then, just as she thought she couldn't bear the tension any longer, she heard a voice, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. It was a man's voice, rough and indistinct, muttering something under his breath. Claire couldn't make out the words, but the tone was menacing, filled with anger. The man was close, too close. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, praying that he wouldn't find her. She could hear him moving through the underbrush, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The sound of his breathing was ragged, as if he was searching for something, someone. Claire's mind raced with fear, but she knew she had to stay quiet. Any sound, any movement could give her away. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Claire could hear the man moving closer, his voice growing louder as he cursed under his breath. Her entire body tensed, every muscle coiled in fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound of his footsteps began to fade, growing more distant with each passing second. Claire kept still, not daring to move until she was sure he was gone. Finally, when the forest had returned to its eerie silence, Claire allowed herself to breathe again. She slowly emerged from her hiding place, her legs shaky as she stood up. Her mind was racing with questions. Who was that man? And why was he out here in the middle of the forest? But there was no time to dwell on it. Claire knew she had to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between herself and whoever, or whatever, was out there. She glanced at the map again, trying to orient herself, but her hands were trembling so badly that she could barely hold it steady. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to focus, to push aside the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Claire continued down the trail, moving as quickly as she could without making too much noise. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent her heart racing, but she forced herself to keep going. She couldn't afford to let fear paralyze her. Not now. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. As she walked, Claire's thoughts returned to her mother's journal. The entries had hinted at something. Someone that Elizabeth had feared. Someone who had been determined to exact revenge. Claire had assumed that Sarah was the one behind it all, but now she wasn't so sure. The man in the forest, the danger that seemed to be closing in on her, it all pointed to something much bigger, something she had yet to fully understand. But one thing was certain, she wasn't alone out here. Someone was hunting her, and she had to find a way out before it was too late. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the forest floor as Claire pressed on. The fear that had gripped her since she heard the man's voice hadn't subsided. In fact, it had only intensified. She knew now that she wasn't just lost in the woods. She was being hunted. Someone was out there, and they were looking for her. Claire's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. Who was the man she had heard? Was he working with Sarah? Or was he someone else entirely? And why was he out here, in the middle of nowhere, stalking her through the forest? The questions swirled in her mind, but no answers came. All she knew was that she had to keep moving to stay ahead of whoever was following her. As the light faded, the forest took on a more sinister appearance. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisting and reaching like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest, once a comforting presence, now felt like a warning. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through Claire's body. She clutched her mother's journal tightly, the leather-bound book her only connection to a world that now seemed impossibly distant. Her mother's words had guided her this far, but Claire knew that she was running out of time. The man was getting closer. She could feel it, and she had no idea how much longer she could evade him. Claire's pace quickened as she followed the faint trail, her eyes darting around for any sign of danger. She knew that the forest could be treacherous at night, and without a clear path, she could easily become even more lost. But staying still wasn't an option, not with a hunter on her trail. The sound of footsteps behind her made Claire's blood run cold. They were distant at first, but growing louder, more determined. She had to keep moving, had to stay ahead. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she broke into a run, her feet pounding against the forest floor as she dodged branches and leaped over roots. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The footsteps grew closer, faster. Claire could hear the man's heavy breathing, the sound of twigs snapping under his weight. He was closing in, and panic surged through her. She could feel the sting of branches scraping her skin, the burn in her lungs as she ran, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close to being caught. Suddenly, the trail ahead split into two paths. Claire hesitated for only a fraction of a second before choosing the narrower path on the left, hoping it would be harder for her pursuer to follow. She ducked under a low-hanging branch, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the path. But the footsteps behind her didn't falter. The man was relentless, his pace matching hers as he closed the distance between them. Claire's mind raced. She couldn't outrun him forever. She needed a plan, something to slow him down, to give her a chance to escape. As she ran, her eyes scanned the ground, looking for anything she could use. Finally, she spotted a large branch lying just off the trail. It was heavy, but if she could time it right, with a burst of adrenaline, Claire veered off the path, grabbing the branch as she went. She positioned herself behind a tree, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Claire gripped the branch tightly, her hands slick with sweat. She counted the seconds in her head, praying that her plan would work. Then, just as the man came into view, Claire swung the branch with all her might. The wood connected with his side, and he let out a grunt of pain as he stumbled backward, caught off guard. Claire didn't wait to see if he recovered. She dropped the branch and ran, her legs burning with the effort. She could hear the man cursing behind her, his footsteps faltering for just a moment before he resumed the chase. But that moment was all Claire needed. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain in her legs, the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. She couldn't stop now. She had to keep going. The forest seemed to blur around her as she ran, the trees rushing past in a dizzying whirl of green and brown. Claire's vision narrowed, her focus solely on the path ahead. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up, but she had no choice. The man was still behind her, his footsteps growing louder with each passing second. Just when Claire thought she couldn't go any further, she spotted something up ahead, a small clearing, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it gave her hope. If she could reach the clearing, maybe she could find a place to hide, to catch her breath. With one final burst of energy, Claire sprinted toward the clearing. The trees parted around her, and she burst into the open space, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The clearing was small, surrounded by thick underbrush on all sides. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. But then Claire saw it, an old, rotting tree trunk lying on its side, partially hollowed out by years of decay. It was barely big enough for her to fit inside, but it was her only option. Claire didn't hesitate. She dove into the hollow trunk, curling up as small as she could, her heart hammering in her chest. The man's footsteps were close now, almost on top of her. Claire held her breath, pressing herself against the rough wood of the trunk, willing herself to be invisible. She could hear him enter the clearing, his heavy breathing filling the air. He was so close that Claire could almost feel his presence, the weight of his gaze as he searched for her. For a moment, everything was still. Claire's heart pounded in her ears, each beat a painful reminder of how close she was to being found. She didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. She could only wait, her body trembling with fear, as the man's footsteps circled the clearing. And then, just when Claire thought she couldn't hold her breath any longer, the footsteps began to fade. The man was moving away, heading back into the forest. Claire stayed hidden, not daring to believe it was over until the sound of his footsteps had completely disappeared. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, gasping for air as she struggled to calm her racing heart. She had escaped for now, but she knew that the danger wasn't over. The man was still out there, and he wouldn't give up so easily. Claire stayed hidden in the tree trunk for what felt like hours, waiting until she was sure the man was gone. When she finally emerged, the clearing was bathed in the dim light of dusk, the shadows growing longer as night approached. Claire knew she had to keep moving, had to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man who was hunting her. She forced herself to stand, her body aching from the strain of the chase. Every muscle screamed in protest, but Claire ignored the pain. She had to keep going. There was no other option. With the clearing behind her, Claire plunged back into the forest, her mind focused on one thing: survival. She had come too far to give up now. No matter what lay ahead, Claire was determined to make it out of the forest alive and to uncover the truth that had brought her here in the first place. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps as she pushed through the dense underbrush, the branches snagging at her clothes and tearing at her skin. The forest had grown darker, the fading light of dusk barely penetrating the thick canopy above. Every step felt heavier than the last, her body aching from exhaustion and fear. But she couldn't stop, not when she was so close to escaping the nightmare that had engulfed her. The man's footsteps had faded into the distance, but Claire knew better than to believe she was safe. He was still out there, somewhere in the woods, and she had no doubt that he would continue hunting her. The realization sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through her, urging her to keep moving, to find a way out before it was too late. As Claire forged ahead, the memory of her mother's journal weighed heavily on her mind. The journal had revealed so many secrets, clues to a past that her mother had desperately tried to protect her from. Claire's heart ached as she thought of the woman who had raised her, who had loved her so fiercely. Elizabeth had known that danger was coming, but she had never imagined it would take this form: a relentless hunt through the wilderness, orchestrated by a woman they had both trusted. The forest was a maze, the twisting paths and towering trees disorienting Claire as she tried to find her way. The map she had found in the cabin was almost useless now, the trails it depicted too faint and outdated to be of much help. Claire's only guide was instinct, the hope that if she kept moving, she would eventually stumble upon a road, a house, something that could lead her back to civilization. As she stumbled over a fallen log, Claire caught sight of something in the distance, a faint glimmer of light, barely visible through the thick trees. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Was it another trap, or had she finally found help? Cautiously, Claire approached the light, her senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made her jump, but she forced herself to keep going. The light grew brighter as she neared, until she could make out its source, a small, flickering campfire nestled in a clearing just ahead. Claire's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she hesitated, torn between the urge to rush toward the fire and the fear that it could be a trap. But she had no other choice. If she didn't take the risk, she might never find a way out of the forest. Stepping into the clearing, Claire's eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. The campfire was surrounded by a few makeshift shelters, tarps strung between trees, blankets laid out on the ground. And there, sitting by the fire, was a man, an older man with a weathered face and graying hair, his expression somber as he stared into the flames. He looked up as Claire approached, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. "What are you doing out here?" Claire hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she had no other option. "My name is Claire," she said, her voice trembling. I was abandoned in the forest. I've been trying to find a way out." The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze hardening as he took in her disheveled appearance, the fear in her eyes. Finally, he nodded, motioning for her to sit by the fire. "You're safe here," he said, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. "For now." Claire sank down onto one of the blankets, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The warmth of the fire was a welcome relief, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax, to believe that she had found a reprieve from the horrors of the day. But the man's next words shattered that fragile sense of peace. "You're not the first to come through here," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the flames. "There have been others, people lost in the forest, chased by someone or something they can't see. Most of them don't make it out." Claire's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked at her, his expression grim. "This forest is not like other places. It's old cursed, some say. Those who come here with darkness in their hearts, well, the forest has a way of punishing them. But it doesn't stop with them. It takes anyone who gets too close. Claire's mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. But I didn't do anything, she protested, the fear rising in her throat. I was just trying to survive. The man nodded slowly. I believe you, he said. But that doesn't mean the forest will let you go. You've been marked, just like the others. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. How do I get out? She asked desperately. There has to be a way. The man hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn compass. This might help, he said, holding it out to her. It's old, but it's reliable. Follow it, and it might lead you to safety. But be careful. The forest doesn't like to let go. Claire took the compass, her hands shaking as she clutched it tightly. It was a small glimmer of hope, but it was all she had. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The man nodded, his expression softening. Don't thank me yet, he said. You still have a long way to go. Claire knew he was right. The forest was still out there, waiting, watching. But now she had something to guide her, something to hold on to in the darkness. And as she stood up, ready to face whatever came next, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She would survive this. She had to. With the compass in hand, Claire stepped back into the forest, leaving the warmth of the fire behind. The darkness closed in around her, but she didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. All that mattered now was finding a way out, finding a way to end this nightmare, once and for all. The forest felt different now. Every step Claire took seemed to reverberate through the earth, as if the very ground was alive, responding to her presence. The compass the old man had given her was clutched tightly in her hand, the needle pointing steadily in one direction. It offered her a sliver of hope, a way out of the twisted maze of trees that had ensnared her. But the forest was not willing to let her go so easily. The air grew colder as she pressed on, her breath visible in the dim light that filtered through the thick canopy above. The sun had set, leaving her in near darkness, with only the faint glow of the moon to guide her. The trees loomed over her, their branches twisting together like gnarled hands reaching down to pull her back into the depths of the woods. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, were magnified in the silence, each one making Claire jump as her heart raced with fear. The old man's words echoed in her mind. The forest doesn't like to let go. She had sensed it before, but now it was undeniable. The forest was alive, and it was angry. It knew she was trying to escape, and it was doing everything in its power to stop her. Claire could feel the hostility in the air, the way the trees seemed to close in around her, the roots reaching up from the ground to trip her as she walked. The compass was her only guide, its needle a small, constant reassurance that there was a way out, if only she could reach it. But the forest was fighting back. The path that had once been clear was now obscured, the underbrush thickening as if the forest itself was trying to trap her. Claire's legs ached from the effort of pushing through the dense foliage, and her clothes were torn from the branches that snagged at her as she moved. Her mind was racing, fear and exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her, but she couldn't afford to stop. She had to keep going. As she forced her way through the underbrush, Claire's foot caught on something, sending her sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed hard on the forest floor, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She gasped, struggling to catch her breath as she looked down to see what had tripped her. It was a root, twisted and thick, jutting out from the ground like a claw. For a moment, she thought she saw it move, as if it had reached out to grab her, but she shook the thought away. She couldn't let her fear get the better of her. Not now. Claire tried to stand, but pain shot through her ankle, forcing her back down. She winced, clutching at the injured limb. It wasn't broken, but it was badly sprained, and the pain was almost unbearable. Panic surged through her. She was hurt, alone in the middle of a forest that seemed determined to keep her trapped, and now she could barely walk. But she had to keep moving. She couldn't stop, not when she was so close. With a grimace, Claire forced herself to her feet, using a nearby tree for support. Every step was agony, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through the pain. The compass in her hand wavered slightly as she stumbled forward, the needle flickering before steadying again. It was still pointing in the same direction, guiding her through the darkness. Claire limped forward, every step a battle against the pain and the forest that seemed to grow more hostile with each passing moment. As she continued, the forest began to change. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining above her to form a nearly impenetrable canopy. The underbrush became denser, the roots rising up from the ground like serpents, trying to ensnare her as she walked. The air grew colder, and Claire shivered as the temperature dropped, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the forest closing in around her, as if it was trying to smother her, to bury her alive. Suddenly, the compass needle began to spin wildly, no longer pointing in a single direction. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she watched it, her hope crumbling as the one thing that had guided her through the darkness failed. She was lost, truly lost, in a forest that had no intention of letting her leave. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, she felt the despair rise up to choke her. But then, through the fog of fear and pain, a memory surfaced, her mother's voice, gentle and reassuring, guiding her as a child. "Trust your instincts, Claire," Elizabeth had often said. "They'll never lead you astray." The memory gave her a glimmer of hope, a small but powerful reminder that she wasn't as helpless as she felt. The forest might be against her, but she had something stronger, a connection to her mother, to the woman who had loved her and fought to protect her from the darkness that now surrounded her. Claire took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. The compass might have failed, but she still had her instincts, her own sense of direction. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the fear and the pain, and listened to the forest, to the rhythm of her own heart, to the faint, almost imperceptible tug that seemed to pull her in a certain direction. It was faint, but it was there, a feeling deep in her gut that told her where to go. She opened her eyes and turned, choosing a direction at random, but trusting that it was the right one. The forest seemed to resist her, the trees crowding in on either side, the roots twisting up from the ground to slow her down. But Claire pushed forward, using every ounce of strength she had left. She limped through the underbrush, her ankles screaming in protest with each step, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. As she walked, Claire began to notice something strange. The forest, once so hostile and suffocating, seemed to be changing again. The trees were still dense, but the underbrush was thinning, the roots less aggressive. The air, which had been cold and oppressive, was growing warmer, lighter. It was as if the forest was beginning to relent, to loosen its grip on her. And then, up ahead, Claire saw it, a faint glow, barely visible through the trees. It was different from the campfire she had found earlier, more distant, but unmistakable. It was light, real, natural light, not the flickering glow of flames. Claire's heart leaped in her chest. It had to be a way out, an opening in the forest, a path back to civilization. With renewed determination, Claire hobbled toward the light, her pace quickening despite the pain. The trees began to thin, the underbrush parting to reveal a narrow path that led to a clearing. As she emerged from the dense forest, Claire blinked in the sudden brightness. The clearing was bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had made it. She had survived the night, survived the forest's wrath. Relief washed over her in waves, the tension that had gripped her for so long finally beginning to ease. She collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion and pain, but she didn't care. She was alive. She was free. But as Claire lay there, staring up at the brightening sky, she knew that her ordeal wasn't over. The forest had let her go, but she still had to face the truth about Sarah, about her mother, and about the dark forces that had conspired to bring her here. Claire pushed herself to sit up, her gaze shifting to the path that led out of the clearing. She couldn't stop now. There was still more to uncover, more to understand. The forest might have been a nightmare, but had also been a test of her strength, her will, her determination to survive. And she had passed. Now, She had to finish what she had started. With great effort, Claire got to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her injured ankle. She took one last look at the forest behind her, the trees standing tall and silent, as if they were watching her, waiting. Then, with the rising sun at her back, Claire set off down the path, ready to confront whatever lay ahead. The sun was fully risen by the time Claire emerged from the forest's edge, its warm rays cutting through the lingering chill of the night. She followed the narrow path, her steps uneven and slow, each one sending a sharp pain through her injured ankle. But the pain was a distant concern compared to the weight that pressed on her heart. The truth she was so close to uncovering loomed before her, dark and ominous. She had to face it. She had no other choice. The path led her to a large, stately house set back from the road, its white columns and manicured lawn stark against the backdrop of the surrounding trees. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she recognized it. This was her home, or rather, the place that had once been her home before Sarah had turned it into something else. The sight of it brought a flood of memories, of her mother's laughter echoing through the halls, of her father's gentle smile. But those memories were tainted now, shadowed by the betrayal that had brought her to this moment. Claire forced herself to walk up the long driveway, each step echoing with the resolve that had carried her through the forest. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door, but she steadied herself, drawing on the strength she had gained from her ordeal. She had survived the forest, and now she would survive this. The door creaked open, and Claire stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of old wood and fading memories. She paused in the foyer, listening for any sign of life. But there was nothing, only the distant ticking of a clock. Claire moved forward, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor as she made her way toward the study. That was where she would find Sarah. She knew it instinctively, as if the house itself was guiding her. As she reached the door to the study, Claire hesitated. This was it, the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for what was to come, then pushed the door open. Sarah was standing by the window, her back to the door, staring out at the morning light. She didn't turn when Claire entered, but there was a tension in her posture, as if she had been expecting this confrontation. The room was filled with the smell of fresh coffee and expensive perfume, a sharp contrast to the damp, earthy scent of the forest that still clung to Claire's clothes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Claire could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. The fear, the anger, the betrayal all mixing together into a powerful force that threatened to overwhelm her. But she pushed it down, focusing on the one thing that mattered, the truth. "You didn't expect me to survive, did you?" Claire's voice was steady, despite the turmoil raging inside her. She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving Sarah's rigid form. Sarah finally turned to face her, her expression carefully controlled, but Claire could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Claire," she said, her voice smooth and practiced, "I'm glad you're safe. We were so worried. Don't lie to me." Claire's voice rose, cutting through the air like a blade. The anger she had been holding back surged to the surface, fueling her words. "You left me out there to die. You thought you could get rid of me, but I'm still here." Sarah's composure faltered, her mask of calm slipping for just a moment. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice colder now. "I've done nothing but care for you, Claire. You've been through a terrible ordeal, but you're not thinking clearly. Let's sit down, talk about this. Enough." Claire's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I know everything, Sarah. I found my mother's journal. I know about the dead, the letters, everything." Sarah's eyes darkened, the pretense of concern falling away as she realized there was no point in denying it any longer. "So, you finally figured it out," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I was wondering how long it would take." Claire's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let fear take hold. "Why?" she demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why did you do it? My mother trusted you. She cared about you. How could you betray her like this?" Sarah's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she took a step toward Claire. "Your mother was a fool," she spat. "She thought she could walk away from her past, from the people she owed. But debts don't just disappear, Claire. They follow you, and eventually they come due. Claire shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. So, you used my father to get what you wanted? You married him, got close to us, just so you could destroy our family. Sarah's lips curled into a bitter smile. It wasn't just about the money, Claire. Your mother ruined lives, my life. She took everything from me, and I was going to make sure she paid for it, one way or another. And when she died, you became the key to settling the score. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of Sarah's words sank in. The woman who had wormed her way into their lives, who had pretended to care, had been plotting their downfall all along. But despite the horror of what she was hearing, Claire felt a strange sense of clarity. The fear and confusion that had clouded her mind were gone, replaced by a fierce determination. She's dead, Sarah. My mother is gone, and no amount of revenge will bring back what you lost. Claire's voice was strong, resolute. But I'm still here, and I'm not going to let you win. Sarah's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing as she realized that Claire was no longer the frightened girl she had tried to manipulate. You think you can stop me? She sneered. You're just a child, Claire. You have no idea what you're up against. I survived the forest, Claire replied, her voice calm and steady. I survived you. I'm stronger than you think. For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. Claire could see the fury in Sarah's eyes, the way her hands clenched at her sides as she struggled to maintain control. But Claire wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced the darkness and come out the other side. Now, she was ready to end this. You have two choices, Claire said, taking a step forward. You can leave, walk away from this house, from my family, and never come back. Or you can stay and face the consequences of what you've done. Either way, you're not a part of my life anymore. Sarah stared at her, disbelief flickering in her eyes. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the sound of a door opening echoed through the house. Claire turned to see her father, Richard, standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn as he took in the scene before him. Claire! Richard's voice was hoarse, filled with confusion and concern. What's going on? Claire felt a wave of relief at the sight of her father, but she knew this wasn't over yet. She turned back to Sarah, her gaze unwavering. Tell him, she said, her voice hard. Tell him the truth. Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking between Claire and Richard as she weighed her options. For a moment, Claire thought she might try to deny everything, to spin another web of lies. But then Sarah's shoulders slumped and the defiance drained from her face. She knew she had lost. I never meant for it to go this far, Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling. But your mother, she took everything from me. I just wanted to make things right, to take back what was mine. Richard looked at her, shock and disbelief written across his face. Sarah, how could you do this? How could you lie to me, to Claire, after everything we've been through? Sarah didn't answer, her eyes downcast as the weight of her actions finally caught up with her. Richard turned to Claire, his expression pained. Claire, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have seen. It's not your fault, Dad, Claire said, her voice softening. She stepped forward, taking his hand in hers. None of this is your fault. Richard squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with guilt and regret. We'll make this right, Claire. I promise you, we'll make this right. Claire nodded, feeling the burden of the past few days finally begin to lift. They had been through so much, but they were still standing together. And that was what mattered. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, her once confident demeanor shattered. She looked at Claire, a flicker of something like regret in her eyes, but it was too late for that. The damage was done, and there was no going back. You need to leave, Claire said, her voice firm. And don't come back. If you do, we'll make sure you face the consequences. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but then she saw the determination in Claire's eyes, the same determination that had carried her through the forest, that had brought her to this moment. Sarah nodded, defeated, and without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. Claire watched her go, her heart heavy but resolute. The door closed behind Sarah, and the house fell into silence once more. It was over. The nightmare that had started in the forest had finally come to an end. Richard pulled Claire into a tight embrace, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I'm so proud of you, Claire. You're so strong." Claire hugged him back, her eyes welling with tears. "I had to be, Dad. For Mom. For us." They stood there for a long moment, holding on to each other, finding comfort in the fact that they had survived together. The sun continued to rise outside, its warm light flooding the room, banishing the shadows that had haunted them for so long. Claire knew that they still had a lot to work through, a lot of healing to do, but they would do it together as a family. The forest had tested her, had pushed her to her limits, but it had also shown her how strong she could be. And now, she was ready to face whatever came next. As the first rays of the morning sun illuminated the room, Claire felt a sense of peace settle over her. The darkness had passed, and a new day had begun. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into the forest, lost and alone. She was a survivor, a fighter, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same strength and determination that had brought her through this one. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and smiled. She was home,